in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Alexander Pullen. He is the Human Resources Business Partner at Hubspot and Doctoral Candidate at the George Washington University, also my alma mater. Alexander, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah, Christina, first, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited for our conversation today. So I'm Alexander. My pronouns are he and him. I am originally from Chicago, Illinois. I've spent a good portion or chunk of my life in the DMV, that's the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And now I'm in the Atlanta metro area as of January of this year. And so I'm still settling in. I'm an HR business partner for inclusion and belonging at HubSpot. And so my role is somewhat of a hybrid role, where part of my role supports some of our functions as a traditional HR BP. And then the other part of my role, in some ways, the more inclusive part of my role is actually focusing on all of our processes and systems and how they contribute or detract in some cases from our inclusion goals. And so I get a chance to talk through everything from something that's seemingly minute as like a manager change to something that's big and normalizes like performance reviews and how those processes contribute to our employees feeling included.
I love that. And when you were younger, did you say that you wanted to be a human resources business partner?
No, I actually didn't know that HR was a field. When I was younger, I knew I wanted to be a judge. That was always the plan. And so when I went to Howard for undergrad, I actually pursued a degree in political science because the plan was to go to law school afterwards. And by the time I graduated, I had some family changes. My mother had gotten sick and I needed to step into a caregiver role. And so law school didn't really mesh with that vision anymore. And so I moved into the government work since I was in DC, and I worked for Health and Human Services and then the State Department. And in that time, I was trying to figure out what are my passions and where do they mesh with a career. So my passion for people development and organization development really mesh well with HR. And so I pursued that as a career.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you sharing your journey to this work as well. It sounds like this is something that you are really passionate about it and you're at the intersection of a really cool job. When you think about this dynamic thing of company culture, how someone experiences HubSpot, knowing that it's very individual, but you were in this role to create systemic change, what are kind of qualitative and quantitative ways you think about measuring this company culture?
Such a great question. Because we all know that measurements are just so important to actually moving the needle in any area you're working in. So we do it a couple ways. One, I think the more qualitative approach is that we in HR are often having some sort of road shows, right? Whether it's within the area you support or even in my role, pockets across the company, trying to better understand from our employees directly what their experience at HubSpot is like. The more quantitative approach is through our quarterly employee survey. So we send out engagement surveys every quarter. Most are, really compact. You can complete them in a couple minutes. And then we have one longer survey each year to really give us a better sense of how our employees are feeling. And then what I would think of is like this mixed methods type approach is through exit interviews and stay interviews. I say they're kind of mixed methods because they often include a survey component and then an interview component where we can really get more data from our employees.
Absolutely. Asking at all parts of the employee journey, whether it's day one or their last day at the organization as well, what their experience is, how can we do better, and really actively listening there too. And in this work in terms of employee experience, being in human resources and creating more inclusive environments, empathy is a skill that needs to be, just like any other skill, practiced and part of this conversation. Can you give an example of how leaders lead with empathy at HubSpot, whether they're senior managers, or any of your peers as well?
Yeah, great question. I think our leaders really nailed this area, and it's there are so many examples. I think the example I will lean on, though, is that our leaders do a really good job of acknowledging what's going on in the world and in the life of our employees. And so, whether that's the murder of George Floyd, whether that's the attack in Ukraine, our leaders do a good job of connecting with our employees' experiences and their humanity by really identifying with their own humanity and how they're feeling as well about all the changes that are going on. And so our leaders do a good job of practicing empathy by giving space for just people's humanity.
I love that. I think that is really critical, especially for senior leaders and people to acknowledge that we can't check our lived experiences, what's going on in
Yeah,
the world at the door or the virtual door as well.
right.
And really
100%.
have conversations. Yeah. Another piece of the employee experience is also when you are doing great work, people want to feel like they're having an impact and that they're recognized. Can you share some of the ways that leaders celebrate the accomplishments and success and career development of employees on your team?
Yeah, I think we do it in a couple of ways. One, at both a company level and a departmental level, there are often regular awards, maybe quarterly awards that are handed out to employees throughout the division based or in alignment with our company values and how our employees are really knocking it out the park. So that's one way. The other way is through a culture of feedback. What I mean is we often encourage our leaders to regularly give feedback to their employees, right? On that regular cadence. And some of that feedback will be constructive, but some of it is recognition for the great work you've done, right? Or even the progress you've made towards some shared goal that we have. And so through feedback, regular feedback, we are often recognizing our employees. And then the other mechanism we use for recognition is by encouraging our employees to speak up about the great work that they're doing. If you're managing a team of 8 or even more, you may not have insight into every part of an employee's work, but we want to encourage the employees because we probably miss some things as managers to really bring that up so that we can make sure we're taking note of it and we can make sure you get the credit that you so rightly deserve.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that's a really holistic way of looking at it as well, and really kind of celebrating the wins, continuing to empower folks as well to celebrate their peers too. In the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned kind of the different parts of your role as well in terms of inclusion, diversity, and equity. And we know that every person and every organization is at a different part of their equity journey and their learning experience. I would love to know, how would you describe HubSpot in today's kind of equity journey? Where are you right
I will say it's hard for me to put us in maybe a category.
now?
I will say though that we have a pretty thoughtful and detailed strategy towards equity. In fact, my role sits on the HR team, which is a little separate from our DIB team. But their strategy for the year, the acronym is create equity, or the phrase is create equity. The acronym is create, and that really talks through how we use community, how we use policies and processes, the various approaches we have to fostering equity. I would think of us as trending in the right direction. We have a solid foundation, but we are obsessed with improving. And that's across the company, I think, but especially in our DIB team, we are obsessed with continuing to create these safe spaces, continuing to promote policies and practices and even programming that supports the need of a diverse workforce.
I love the mindset of continuously improving. Just because something is working really well today does not mean it's going to work 6 months from now when you have more employees, when you have
Yeah,
different employees in different departments.
100%.
And just looking internally, consistently auditing as well. I think especially over the past few years too is just a ripe time to look at what's working and what we can improve on.
Yeah.
I had the privilege of attending a conference earlier this year, and there was a panel around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I love this question. So I want to ask, how is HubSpot not perpetuating trauma that happens externally in the world, internally at the company. And I think that's related to what we were talking about as well in terms of leaders really acknowledging what's happening around the world. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I love this question because I think it it really speaks to the expectation that so many of us have, is that when we get into our organization, we won't be harmed in the way that we can be harmed outside the organization.
Mhm.
But the reason I love it is because it gives me the opportunity to highlight, as long as you're going to have people in any organization, in any group, you won't be able to prevent the harm or the trauma.
Mhm.
So what we focus on, understanding that people will people, even I'm married, I love my wife. Even two people who love each other, at times we're going to say something that may not be as helpful, and sometimes it's hurtful. So the question becomes, well, understanding that people will fall short, people will cause offenses sometimes,
Yeah.
people will speak out of turn. What can we do, or how can we think about it in such a way that we can still ultimately protect our employees? A couple ways we think about it. One is we lean heavily into psych safety. And psych safety is really just this feeling of being able to say, hey, this doesn't feel right, or be able to say, hey, I made a mistake, be able to be human, and somebody is receptive to it, or know that the organization is receptive to it. And so we try to lean on empowering all of our employees to say, Christina, when we had that conversation earlier, you made this comment, and this is how I took it, but I wanted to open it up to better understand, was that your intent, or maybe I missed the message, or
Yeah.
what have you. And you and I can work out what was the intent, what was the impact, and where do we go from here. And so we lean on psych safety a lot. And recently I've started to think about the other side of that. Um, we want people to be able to say, hey, I this didn't land well. We also want people to also lead with grace. And it's not a word we use often in the work setting, but if the reality is that we will cause offense at some point in every relationship, um, it's important for us to learn from the situation, to get back up, to make amends, to be uh, a professional enough to say I'm sorry, which is I think is a very professional thing to do,
Yes,
a
absolutely.
human thing to do.
Yeah.
And move forward. Well, the key to moving forward, though, is to be able to receive a little some sense of grace, right? Because if I always hold that against you, you and I would never be able to have a productive relationship. But if I have that conversation with you, you try to make amends, I should also give you a little bit of grace. And as we grow, as we scale, as we become increasingly diverse in a global company, we need both like safety. We need people to lead with to really embrace their humanity and say I'm sorry when they make a bad call or a mistake. And we also need some grace.
Mhm. I think showing others grace and yourself grace during these conversations. Number one, having the conversation. How do you respond?
Yeah.
How are you kind of initiating it as well? And then how are you committing to knowing better and doing better and continuously having that growth mindset as well?
Yeah.
And holding ourselves and each other accountable in a really graceful way. So I love the way that you have said that in terms of that continuous kind of auditing process and kind of improving the experience for everyone. Is there kind of a system or process or policy initiative, any kind of example of how HubSpot or your team has made something more equitable over the past couple of years after knowing something or just wanting to create something different?
Yeah, there are, I think there are so many examples. Uh, even even when I think through this last performance cycle, we do performance reviews twice a year.
Yeah.
And this last cycle, we put all managers across the organization through additional training to help align the way we think about performance management, with a heavy focus on mitigating bias and ensuring the development of all of our employees, regardless of where they are in the world, regardless of how close they are, how distant they are from you. We've leaned heavily into making sure all of our managers have the tools so that we know we're driving performance, high performance in a very equitable way. So in terms of like a process tweak,
Yeah,
having all of your managers take time out to go through a live training, that's a major tweak. But
absolutely.
it has such a big benefit for not only our managers, but our employees across the board. And then the other side of it is that's kind of the purpose of my role, looking through how can I support better equity across the board. And that could include things like I did an employee relations session with all HR business partners on how we're thinking through employee relations, right? And making sure we're aligning on how we're coaching the organization in terms of employee relations. We're even looking at something as minute as manager change, and understanding that manager change can really have an impact on the feelings of inclusion our employees experience. So we're even looking into that to how can we make sure employees feel supported, included, regardless of the manager they have, right? And so there's so many. I wish I could just nail some of the best ones, but those are at least a few that come to mind.
No, I think those are great ones because I mean, we talk about all the time the impacts that a great and needs improvement manager should have on an organization. Your manager is someone you're talking to on a more regular basis than your CEO, than the chief people
Right.
officer, than other folks across the organization too. So really making that investment to make sure that everybody is aligned as well, and really investing authentically in the career development of the team is really important. I know,
Yeah.
these are really important examples, and it sounds like HubSpot has a really holistic way of looking at the employee experience and creating more equity. What is your philosophy, Alexander, about measuring diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging initiatives and strategies? And I ask because we know that we're not looking to check a box here, but we know that what gets measured gets funded, gets invested in. People want to know what progress we're making as well.
Yeah. I think we in general have a philosophy similar to what you said. What isn't measured isn't moved. And so we lead with data oftentimes, but it's not just the numbers, it's not just the surveys, it's the engagement with our people. It's really going back to the idea that across HR, we're doing road shows at any given point, right? To better understand what's going on and to use that to supplement some of the more quantitative data points we're getting, to understand if if a program, a policy, any type of change is as impactful as we hope it would be. And so we're leading with data, but we're not only relying on data. Understanding that there's so much more than somebody can say in their survey.
Absolutely. You have to provide that context and understand kind of
Yeah,
you're getting that information from someone as well, and asking and continuing to ask on a regular basis. Are there any
yeah,
examples of how that employee feedback, no matter when or how it was conveyed to you individually or through a different mechanism, has inspired a change in a policy or initiative as well at the organization?
yeah. I'm actually going to go back to the manager change. We first realized it was an issue through through random conversations we were having across the business, where we would talk to an employee maybe about a performance issue, and they brought up how many managers they've had in a certain amount of period and how that impacted their understanding of their role, and so that we started with that anecdotal data or that qualitative data, and then we verified it with some of some other data we have, particularly around like attrition, manager change, and comparing those numbers. And that led us to start to make some adjustments to our manager change process, just to support what we were hearing
Mhm.
on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to understand from multiple different employees, kind of what you're going to do around that as well, and demonstrating that you are actively listening by making that change and having that conversation too. In terms of your perspective, so not in relation to HubSpot and things like that,
Sure.
there's been a lot of press, television, TV series around not so great, toxic workplaces, whether it's a documentary or, around Abercrombie and Fitch about their very public and numerous examples of discrimination, or We Crashed, which is supposed to be a fictional series around WeWork as well. Is there ever a point of no return for a brand because they have caused an immense amount of harm? If not, what advice do you have to initiate that intentional repair? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, great question. I think a point of no return for any organization is when there's an unwillingness to be honest about what this is.
Mm-hmm.
I am less, because I try not to label organizations as good or bad or right or wrong, because I found often that those labels are not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
What I do try to lean in on, and I guess it still is a label, but do you have an honest culture? Are you honest about what you value and what's not value? Are you honest about how people can progress in the organization and what that looks like? Are you honest about if work-life balance is a thing there? Are you honest about who gets favored, or what type of personalities, what type of demographics get favored and which don't? Are you honest about these things? Because I feel like that's so important, because if you're honest about it, you give potential candidates as well as employees an opportunity to say, this is something that aligns with my personal values, or it isn't, right? But when you're not honest, when you're living in a facade, when you don't want to accept the harm you've caused or the damage you've caused, we can literally do nothing with your organization. As a consultant or HR practitioner, we can't do anything. And so it really, if leaders aren't able to admit when they've made a bad call, when things have not gone the way they intended, or they did, but they didn't anticipate the hurt that it was going to cause. When leaders aren't able to do that, I think we can't do anything with your organization.
Mm-hmm. You have to be honest. And I think that goes to our conversation earlier around when you realize that you made a mistake, or you realize you said something that caused unintended harm. What do you do with it now? And honesty, vulnerability, empathy is part of that conversation. Grace is part of that conversation too. And we know honesty is important, that intentional effort to do better is important. Are there any other common mistakes you're seeing organizations or leaders making in their diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, or human resources and people strategy today? Of course, without naming names, just things you're seeing out in the universe.
Yeah. I'm going to bring up the lack of honesty about what the situation is. I'll also say, I think sometimes there may be this over-reliance on programming that may not actually move the needle in areas that what we're hearing employees care about. Employees want to make sure that they have equitable opportunity to grow in an organization. And sometimes I've spoken with colleagues across the board, and they want to, watch a movie together, have teams watch this movie together, or read a book together. And while that serves its purpose, the question we always should be asking is, what do we want to see on the other side, right? And does this programming actually contribute to that goal? And being honest about if it does, if it doesn't, because sometimes I found that some of this work becomes more performative than it is impactful. And so not having those honest conversations about where we're trying to get to, and then creating changes, programming, processes, policies to get there, I think that's one of the issues. And then in some other organizations, we just we have, the organization says aloud that they they value diversity, they value inclusion, but they don't resource that area. And
Yeah.
so you have these departments of one where they have this massive organization. They're expected to be all things to everyone. And it shows that you're not really serious about this work, right? Because if you were, you would fund this area. And so that's another issue that I see. So lack of honesty, uh, lack of measurements or really driving impact or focused impact, and then the lack of funding, I see as some of the more common areas.
Yeah, be honest and really invest in setting people up for success if this is something that you say that you care about as well. And
Yeah.
really understanding that, having those conversations. You mentioned the word performative too, and there have been a lot of conversations around if organizations or leaders are being authentic or if they're being performative, intent versus impact. We're almost at June 2022. Yay for us. Um, how is HubSpot honoring and celebrating Pride Month this year and recognizing that this is something that I'm sure you're doing, supporting LGBTQIA plus employees 365 days a year? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we have an amazing DIB team, and some of our partners there, or program managers on that team, they lead a host of events. I mean, wherever you are in the world, you have some events available to you. And so we really do massive, we have a massive all out programming effort to make sure everybody's learning, everybody's growing, and learning how to be better allies with our colleagues in that community. And so it's going to be crazy. I mean, it really is going to be crazy the type of impact that programming has, because I learn so much. You know, as someone who tries to be an ally, I learn so much from the speakers, the workshops, and just getting some more time to connect with colleagues across the globe is always cool too.
I love it. I think having that global strategy is really important too, to make sure people are seen, heard, and understood. Alexander, is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share with folks who are listening, or maybe underscoring 1 to 2 key insights you hope people bring with them?
You know, I these have been really great questions here. I will underscore a couple points. One, um, sometimes I think it's easy to get overwhelmed with all the work that's required to build really great cultures that speak to your employees' needs, right?
Yeah.
But if we go back to the basics of things like supporting psychological safety across the board, uh, making sure leaders lead with accountability and empathy, uh, and make sure we're extending grace to ourselves and to others. I think the other pieces of uh, a really great DIB initiative or strategy, and the other pieces of a really great culture, they really will fall into place. But sometimes it's worth just getting back to those basics.
And having those core values at the root of all of the different things that you're doing and actions you're taking. It could be really
Yeah,
easy to get into the weeds and really think about, all of the work and all of the emotional labor it takes and all of the things, but
right.
really going back to those key values is
Yeah,
important. Alexander, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon. I really enjoyed our conversation.
same here, Christine. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the company to succeed overall. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.